Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for organizing this event. And thanks to STM and the colleagues I've had a chance to work with in preparing. So what I thought I would talk about is a little bit of historical context, which is when we think about research agendas, it's important to realize that they're set by people. And historically, certainly in the US and I think in many parts of the globe, the faculty have played a role, really, a critical role, in setting the research agenda, because typically they want to investigate something that they're passionate about, whatever field that happens to be. And that's led to lots of knowledge accumulated over time, lots of new technological capabilities. And however we go forward, we want to keep the best elements of that, because that kind of curiosity-driven research agenda, as it's often described, has really been a strength of the research enterprise globally. Increasingly, though, of course, we have societal problems, and we only need to think about COVID and climate change and forced migration to realize that we need research in these areas, and oftentimes that's going to require teams of individuals from different disciplines and so forth. So what I want to try to do today is, as we're kind of at a cusp of transition where we want to integrate this sort of societal impact of research and a societally driven research agenda with a curiosity-driven research agenda. What might that look like, and how might we chart our progress? And I want to give you a sense of some of the ways we might think about that in my remarks today. The basis for a number of the examples that I'll give you are to use data analytics. And I think you're probably familiar with the Scopus database that Elsevier has, which contains some 90 million peer-reviewed scholarly outputs from some 7,000 publishers, millions of author profiles, tens of thousands of affiliation profiles, some 1.7 billion references, and something like 130 million patent records. It allows for linking of data and also use of AI tools, which you'll see represented in a number of the examples that we'll talk about. And the way I've set the talk up is that I want to give you a little more of the context historically for where we are and where we can be going, the platforms that are being used to think about something like societal impact. We'll talk about research outputs, research outcomes and impacts, and then generative AI. As part of the background for this, Elsevier over the past year has actually organized roundtables and surveys with various partner organizations, like Ipsos, for example. And we've had a chance to hear from really hundreds of academic leaders, funding leaders from around the world. And this idea of a greater focus on the societal impact of research really does appear to be something that's on people's minds throughout the world. And it's in the context of research excellence, educational excellence, our recognition of all of the political issues that are playing out in many parts of the world. And so it was actually quite encouraging to hear that this approach of thinking about research agendas from what they can do for society is something that's really gaining traction. And Elsevier has also been talking with the academic community in particular about what would an academic evaluation framework look like that was more comprehensive and holistic in nature. And this is just a skeleton of what we've constructed thus far, and it's built around 5 pillars. The far left pillar are the inputs that go into research, and you'll recognize that they're resource-based. It's the people, it's the funding, it's the equipment and facilities that are used. The next pillar adjacent to it is teaching. And the idea in education, there are teaching and learning indicators, and we can think about new ways to carry out the educational mission. The next 2 pillars lie at really the nexus of research and education. The third one is research and education processes or throughput. It would include the culture of research, the kinds of collaborations that exist. And then next to that is the knowledge that's created, the scholarly outputs. And this would include quantity and quality kinds of indicators. And finally, the one that we've historically had perhaps less focus on, but with societal impact we're thinking more about it, are the outcomes and impact of the investments that are made in research. And this has many different dimensions. There's economic impact, political impact, cultural impact, and so on. And what we've begun to do in consultation with the global academic community is to begin to fill these in with what could be potential metrics. And we'll talk about some of those as I go through the various examples that are seen. But the point here is that by discussing what's important to various groups around the world as they think about research investments, we can begin to define the sorts of indicators that might tell us what kind of progress we're making toward the objectives. If we want to think about platforms, one of the most important ones, and I think you're all familiar with this, are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Here in the US, they've been slower to gain traction, but we're beginning to see signs that more and more organizations are beginning to make use of them. And I think you're familiar with the 17, number one being no poverty, for example, number two, zero hunger, and so forth. And you'll recall that these were announced in the year 2015. They were endorsed by all the member nations. And the idea was the pursuit of these goals would, by the year 2030, lead to a world that was more fair and more sustainable. And we're more than halfway along that timeline now, and I'm sure we'd all agree we have a long way to go yet to meet the objectives. Let me show you a way that the SDGs can be used to really help organizations create storylines or narratives around what they're doing in research. And what I've chosen as an example is one that we've looked at Elsevier for about a year now, which is a group of institutions in the US that are called the HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities. There are about 100 of them. Historically, they've been under-resourced, but we thought they might have a valuable story to tell. And what we did was we looked over the decade, beginning in the year 2013 and running through 2022, and it's actually an impressive story. They've published collectively, these roughly 100 institutions, nearly 50,000 scholarly outputs. That works out to an average of a little over a dozen a day for every day of the year. They involve something like 26,000 authors and co-authors. And the scholarly distribution is shown by the color ring at the bottom. Basically, all of the scholarly fields are represented across those institutions. And by knowing that disciplinary breakdown and the kinds of outputs, whether they're books or journals, monographs, what have you, and knowing the year in which they were published, you could arrive at an estimate of how many citations those articles should have garnered. And that's set at exactly 1.0. And the 1.35 figure that you see on the slide, the field-weighted citation impact, as it's called, means that those articles actually collectively gathered 35% more citations than one might have predicted. And so that's a good measure of scholarly impact. But the story gets even better when we look at connections with the SDGs, because many of their articles could be linked to one or more of the SDGs. And so what we've done here is we've compared the HBCU portfolio of scholarly outputs over that decade to the United States as a whole, the US national output portfolio. And you could look at the relative numbers of publications in each portfolio that could be linked to the SDGs. And to make the story relatively easy to see, what we've done is we've taken the percentage for the US portfolio and set it to exactly 1.0 for each of the SDGs. And that's the dashed horizontal line that you see running across the figure. And what you observe in the bars, that's the percentage of the HBCU portfolio that could be linked to the SDGs, is that for most of them, the HBCUs are in the same ballpark or higher. In fact, for a trio of the SDGs, number 2, which is zero hunger, number 4, which is quality education, number 10, which is reduced inequality, the percentage is actually roughly twice what's in the US portfolio. And that's a really good story to tell about societal impact. In fact, we've worked with a group of HBCUs, the 1890s as they're called, which are in the US land-grant institutions. And they've created an infographic that really summarizes a lot of this and that helps them make the case that their research enterprise is vibrant and worthy of additional investments. It's also possible to link patent activity to the SDGs. This is data for the City University of New York system, which comprises about 24 campuses. And you'll recognize the colors in the circumference as the colors associated with the SDG icons. And the wedges that you see represent portfolio activity related to patenting. And the largest wedge that you see is in brown, and that corresponds to SDG number 12, which is responsible consumption and production. So it's a way to pictorially illustrate where you are making investments that are paying off in terms of patenting activity. The database also allows you to look at citations and policy documents. And this is an example from the University of Glasgow spanning a decade. And you can see in the portion on the left of the graphic that over that time span, there are several thousand citations to University of Glasgow articles that have been published in policy documents and in regulations. And they include such organizations as the World Health Organization, World Bank, OECD, and so forth. Again, these are examples that researchers can point to, their organizations can point to, as having impact and showing up in these outputs, in this case, policy and regulation. So we talked about the SDGs as a platform, but platforms can be set by governments as well. And 2 years ago in the US, we had landmark legislation that was signed into law called the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. And there are a number of noteworthy features of that legislation. One is that Congress identified 10 areas, they call them key technology areas or KTAs, where they really wanted to see investments lead to considerable technology and progress. And so the examples that you see from the 10 KTAs include artificial intelligence, quantum information, science and technology, biotech, advanced materials. Another feature of the legislation was that it created, for the first time in more than 30 years, a new directorate at the US National Science Foundation. Historically, NSF has supported basic research. That's been its objective. But this particular directorate is different. It's called TIP, for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And it's really focused on translational research and use-inspired research. The idea was that Congress wanted to see the kinds of vibrant innovation activity that is associated with Silicon Valley, San Diego, Boston, the Research Triangle, and North Carolina across the entire country. And so how do you create regional innovation ecosystems? And this was a real departure for the federal government because historically they have not focused on this kind of place-based investment. But this was significant development. And the signature program that the TIP Directorate rolled out soon after it was created is something called Regional Innovation Engines, or ENGINES for short. And it really is the idea of creating these innovation ecosystems across the entire country. They went about this in an unusual way for the foundation, which is that before the proposals were actually submitted, what they requested was a very brief concept outline that was publicly posted. And the idea was that if somebody was reading about this and said, gee, I would like to work on that, they would have a chance to contact the principal investigator, the person in charge of the project, and potentially join that effort. What we did at Elsevier was we thought it would be interesting to see how well these mapped onto the SDGs. And what we found is that for the nearly 700 concept outlines that were submitted, we could actually link nearly 2/3 of them, about almost 450, to one or more of the SDGs. And you see in the bar chart on the left what the breakdown looks like in terms of how many of those concept outlines could be linked to each of the SDGs. The largest one, as you can see, is number 9. That's industry, innovation, and infrastructure, perhaps not surprisingly. So they've made now 2 kinds of awards at the TIP Directorate. The first of these that were announced were called Engines Development Awards, and there were some 44 of them, each for up to $1 million and for up to 2 years in duration. And you can see from the bubbles on the map of the US that they are in fact beginning to cover large regions of the country that had been relatively underinvested in for long periods of time. The other feature that's interesting is that NSF wanted to make use of this KTA platform, the key technology areas. And so if you look at the right-hand part of the graphic, what you see running from left to right in headings are those 10 areas, AI on the left, all the way through materials on the right. And each of those blue boxes represents an award that could be mapped to that particular key technology area. So they're able to track this. When Congress in the US asks, what are you doing in these areas? This is a very simple pictorial representation. The really serious money is in the Type 2 Engines Awards. And the first cohort of 10 of these were just announced recently. And these are awards of up to $160 million for a period of up to a decade. And again, they're spread out around the country. If you read the names of them, they include advanced agriculture technology in North Dakota, Colorado and Wyoming in the West, climate resilience. You also see examples of aerospace innovation, that's in the Texas, New Mexico area, and so on going around. Many of these are energy focused, but you also see focus on water technologies and so forth. So these are potentially going to have a huge impact on the region. And I thought it might be interesting to drill down on one of them. And so the one that I've chosen is the Southwest Sustainability Innovation Engine, which is based in Arizona. And this gives you an idea of the kinds of coalitions that were put together to create this winning proposal. There are universities that are at the core of this: Arizona State, University of Utah, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. But there are also lots of community groups, local governments. You see the legend at the lower left, for-profits that are involved, state, local, and tribal governments. There are also NGOs and philanthropic organizations, venture capital, startups, and so forth. So this is a really yeasty mixture of organizations that are working together, and now they have a substantial amount of funding to really try to do the kind of transformational work that's going to have a significant impact in that region of the country. We can also look at this through the lens of the SDGs. If you go to the SDG website, you can take the abstract of any of these awards and have a graphic representation of the kind of impact that they can have. So the graphic on the left is kind of a word cloud, and you can see for this award, not unexpectedly, water is an important focus, innovation, energy, resources. The right-hand graphic shows you the SDG color-coded representation of where the impact could be expected, both in terms of the SDGs and then the subheadings. There are targets and there are indicators that let you have more granularity on the kinds of contributions the project might make. And you see again that in orange, number 9, industry, innovation, infrastructure is a big theme. But in light blue as well, clean water and sanitation, SDG 6, is another area that's going to be developed in this context. Let me turn to a couple of other important outputs and outcomes and impact measures. We've been working with Cornell, in particular through the research office, and 2 of their colleges, engineering and the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, on two projects of mutual interest. One of these has to do with what happens to the alumni. And this is really an important issue for many campuses, as well as for federal funders. Huge amounts of money are invested in education and training, and being able to track the impact that these graduates have once they launch their professional trajectories can be a very compelling story as well. And so what we did with Cornell was they provided the names of doctoral graduates going back as far as the year 2000, and then looking in 5-year increments of graduation, so 2005, 2010, and so forth. And what we found is that between Scopus and LinkedIn, you could find roughly 80% of these folks. And in fact, in the more recent cohorts, it's more like 90%. And it's quite interesting to look at what they're doing and where they're doing it. So as you might expect, most of the Cornell doctoral alumni in those two colleges have remained in the US. And this is just a map that illustrates where they're located, and the color coding gives you the employment sector they're working in. So yellow is business and industry, dark blue is education, and so forth. And the bar graph at the bottom just shows you that as you go from the earlier cohorts to the more recent ones, the percentage remaining in the US is increasing. We can look more closely at which portions of the US they're working in. So New York State, for example, 25%. California is nearly 20%. Again, the color coding of the dots shows you what kind of work, what sector they're working in. And you could also compare those numbers in each state relative to the number of doctorate holders in science, engineering, and medical fields, health fields. To give a sense of the numbers in aggregate, and this surprised our colleagues in the research office, about half of the doctoral alumni were working in industry, about a third in education. They would have guessed the opposite. And then you can also see from LinkedIn the titles. So if we look at the business and industry sector, the titles are scientist, director, co-founder, chief technology officer, and the like. If we look in the education sector, we see professorial types of titles, as well as director, lecturer, and researcher. So it's a way to really better understand in aggregate where the graduates are going. And we actually had a similar request from NSF. Every year they award graduate fellowships in a national competition. And they asked us if we could find those who had graduated some 30 years ago, who had been supported 30 years ago. And again, we were able to find some 90% of them using data from Scopus and LinkedIn. The other project we did with Cornell is in the realm of economic impact. Cornell was interested in, could they link up the funding that comes in, which is over $1 billion a year to the campus in terms of R&D expenditures, with publications coming from the campus, with patents, and with commercialization data, in particular licenses and startup companies. And what we were able to do was, using a combination of Scopus data and data that Cornell provided related to commercialization, scrubbed of any sensitive information like dollar amounts and specific companies, we were able to see that there was a common taxonomy, topic clusters that could be used to connect these various databases. And that allowed us to construct, with their help, a picture that could be used for, if you will, predictive analyses. What you see in this chart with the bubbles are various subfields of research at Cornell, and the bubbles are color-coded. So all of the bubbles of one color are subfields of a given field. If the field is medicine, subfields might be dentistry and oncology, for example. The size of the bubble is proportional to the number of patent families. The horizontal position reflects the amount of funding coming into that subfield over this period of roughly a decade. And the vertical position is the number of publications. And what's particularly interesting are the outliers, because there are some subfields where you have a lot of money coming in and there's not a lot of patenting activity. And there are other subfields where there isn't as much money coming in, but there's a lot of patenting activity. And you can imagine the technology transfer office at the campus, the deans of the colleges that are involved in this enterprise are all quite interested in why is that. With Cornell's help, we were also able to look at the licensing in these subfields. So this is the same group of subfields I just showed you. We've made the bubbles all the same size, and we've positioned them and color-coded them so that we can see the licensing percentages. So what you see in terms of the horizontal position of the subfield is how many patent families are in it, and the vertical position is how many of those patent families have been licensed. It's a little easier if we say, take these bubbles and just make them pie charts, and then the red portion of the pie chart is the percentage that's licensed, the gray portion is the percentage that's unlicensed. And you can see for bubbles at the very right, for example, that it's a relatively small part of the portfolio that's been licensed. There are some bubbles toward the left that are almost completely red, indicating that there's been almost complete licensing activity. The next stage of this is we're also in consultation with a number of other campuses that would like to look at these kinds of data for benchmarking purposes, because if you have an outlier, is it just an outlier at your institution, or would you find this at other peer institutions as well? So these are new kinds of measures that we can begin to think about as we explore economic impact as it might arise from campuses. Let me turn now to some of the developments in generative AI that I think have tremendous potential. And as Elsevier has been developing product in this area, there are a few elements that have been really top of mind. One is that this is an opportunity to try to build trust with various stakeholders. So using Scopus data, which is high quality, it's generally peer-reviewed literature, and using advanced prompt engineering, you can reduce the risk of hallucinations, which can be, of course, misleading. And what you'd like to be able to do as well is be able to reference the primary literature that has been drawn upon in conclusions coming from generative AI so that you have transparency. Another key element is working with the community as you develop these tools. So by having input from colleagues from around the world, as Elsevier has done this, there's the opportunity to really shape this in a way that users would be compelled to use it because they've had a hand in creating it and in shaping the way that it's going to be used. And then finally, one of the important elements is, can it be used to break down barriers, say across disciplines, for people who want to jump from one field to another to be able to get up to speed quickly? So those are aspects of the development that goes into this. There are also a set of responsible AI principles that Elsevier works with, namely that you want the real-world impact of solutions on people to be top of mind, actions to prevent the creation or reinforcement of unfair bias, being able to explain how the solutions work, creating accountability because there is human oversight, and then respecting privacy and championing robust data governance. And these are vector searches that are done. This just shows an illustration graphically of how an object or a phrase like how to be a better human gets translated for use in the generative AI. And what I thought might be interesting is just show you a couple of screenshots of examples that might be of interest. So the question that I put into the query box was, how does research at University of California campuses contribute to eliminating poverty, SDG 1? And what the generative AI tool, Scopus AI as it's called, will return is information about, in a summary form, it'll present, for example, particular aspects of the summary like community campus partnerships, and it also gives a direct link to the primary literature. And so you see ones and twos here, and then you could go and look up those references and see if you agree with what's been summarized. Other characteristics that this particular tool will give you is a concept map. And so as you can see on the map, you can have a particular concept that's present and see how it leads to other concepts and how those lead to additional concepts and the like as a way to drill down. And then finally, it has a section on digging deeper where it will present other kinds of information that you might be asking about or interested in asking about that lets you learn more about maybe particular centers on campuses that are focused on eliminating poverty, other collaborations, and so on. So I think this is really a remarkable frontier in terms of what ultimately Gen AI could be used to do that could help us understand societal impact and really think about, in a forward way, how to nurture it. So let me conclude with a few thoughts that I think helped me when I was trying to bring these ideas together. And I've grouped them in two categories. One is that just in an overall sense, what we're seeing is kind of a global interest now in this area of societal impact of research. And it's evident in a few ways. One is in the thought leadership surveys of the academic and funder leaders that I showed you earlier. There is increasing use of platforms like the Sustainable Development Goals and the key technology areas by campuses and by funders. And what we're seeing also at many institutions is a more expansive view of what counts that's driven by societal needs. And we certainly see this at some of the funding agencies as well, as I showed you with the new directorate at NSF. I think there are opportunities for publishers as well, namely these tools for research officers and funders that link data analytics to primary literature and enable the creation of narratives. There's the outreach to underserved scholarly communities to build capacity and voice, as I illustrated with the HBCUs. And then there's the use of generative AI, which is just emerging to facilitate research practices and I think to enhance trust with stakeholders. And finally, let me acknowledge my colleagues at Elsevier and at Cornell who helped with putting this together. And if something occurs to you afterwards and you'd like to get in touch, you can reach me at a.ellis@elsevier.com. Thanks for listening.